You before when we were in the Western Theater that Vicksburg was the final holdout of the port cities as far as the Union's philosophy to take control of the Mississippi River and cut the Confederacy in half. And it was kind of ironic because on the same day that General Lee and the Confederates were retreating from Gettysburg, an important Union victory in the Western Theater was won. On July 4th of 1863, July 4th of 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant and Union forces captured Vicksburg, Mississippi. On July 4th, 1863, as General Lee and the Confederates were retreating from Gettysburg, General Grant and Union forces captured the port city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now this was a tough but sweet victory for Grant because the Union had tried to capture this southern city 5 times prior to this and failed. These people held out like you wouldn't believe. And you'll see a very good example of the Battle of Vicksburg when I show you the movie, The Blue and the Gray, when we've completed this unit on the Civil War. So it was a very sweet victory for General Grant and the Union forces because they had failed to capture the southern city 5 times prior to that. Now, Union forces had surrounded Vicksburg and bombed Vicksburg for many, many weeks. And it was just unbelievable. They would lob cannon shells into that town and basically destroyed one of the most beautiful historic cities this country's ever seen. People were starving. They obviously were not allowing supplies or food or medicines to come into Vicksburg. And finally, the southern people could not hold out any longer, and they surrendered. Now, with this Union win and the capture of Vicksburg, the Union strategy in the Western Theater was complete. The Union had now gained control of the Mississippi River and cut the Confederacy in half. And that will take us to our next subtopic, which is the Battle of Chattanooga. Anybody know what state Chattanooga's in? It's in Tennessee. Okay, the Battle of Chattanooga. Now, after the fall of Vicksburg, the Union's goal was to capture the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And that was the city that was located on the Tennessee River, right on the Tennessee-Georgia border. So we're looking right here. Here's Chattanooga right here. And it's right on the Tennessee River, and it's right on the border of Georgia. Why would they want to take this city of Chattanooga? What does it set them up for? Well, kind of, but it's going to set them up to sweep the South, starting in which state? Georgia. So the idea behind the Union is they want to capture Chattanooga, look up here at the map, which clears the way for them to go into Georgia and basically clear the South out and attack Richmond from the south. Okay? So Chattanooga was a city located on the Tennessee River, right on the Tennessee-Georgia border, and a victory in Chattanooga would open the way for an invasion of Georgia and the lower South. So in September of 1863, Union General William Rosecrans battled Confederate forces under the command of General Braxton Bragg. In September of 1863, at Chattanooga, Union General William Rosecrans battles Confederate forces under the command of General Braxton Bragg. Well, at a famous battle at Chickamauga Creek, the rebels actually defeated Union forces there. In a very important battle near Chattanooga at Chickamauga Creek, the rebels defeated Union forces. Now this is kind of interesting because in the past, what would the Union general have done after losing? Retreated. Well, after losing to the Confederates at Chickamauga Creek, Union General Rosecrans salvaged enough of his army to stay put until General Grant arrived with reinforcements. Usually they would cut and run. Rosecrans was smart enough to stay put, hang on the best he could, salvage as many troops as he could after his loss at Chickamauga Creek, and wait till Grant arrived with reinforcements, which he did. Grant arrives with Generals Joe Hooker, George Thomas, and William T. Sherman and their troops. Grant arrives at Chickamauga Creek with General Joe Hooker, General George Thomas, and General William T. Sherman and their men, and will now support Rosecrans in trying to secure Chattanooga.
Who's the Hooker guy?
Joe Hooker was the guy that had commanded before. He was the guy that commanded just before Gettysburg, who resigned as overall commander of Union forces, remember?
Oh, yeah.
He lost at Chancellorsville. So, along with General Grant, were Generals Joe Hooker, George Thomas, and William T. Sherman and their troops. Because of these reinforcements, the Union win two major victories at Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge near Chattanooga. So with these reinforcements, the Union wins two key battles at Chattanooga. First at Lookout Mountain and then at Missionary Ridge. And these victories at Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge secure Chattanooga and also secure the Tennessee-Georgia border for the Union. So again, these Union victories at Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge at Chattanooga will secure the Tennessee-Georgia border for the Union. Now there's what you need to know. By securing the Tennessee-Georgia border, the Union now has paved the way for General William Sherman's famous March to the Sea, which will happen in the upcoming spring. So the victory at Chattanooga gives the Union control of the Tennessee-Georgia border and will open up the way for Union General William Sherman's March to the Sea in the upcoming spring. Okay, so you can kind of see what's going to happen now, right? What do you think Sherman's march to the sea is going to be? He's going to march through Georgia, up through South Carolina, North Carolina, into Virginia, and then they're going to still fight in Virginia, and the goal is to capture the Confederate capital, Richmond. Okay, that's the goal. So we're going to move to our next subtopic, which is the Civil War back in the East. And Lincoln's going to make another change in overall commander. And who's he going with this time? Ulysses S. Grant. This will be his final change of overall commanders. And he will replace George Meade with Ulysses S. Grant. And he does that on March 9th, 1864. On March 9th, 1864, President Lincoln appoints General Ulysses S. Grant as overall commander of Union forces. And what Grant does is when he is named overall commander, he takes control of the eastern armies, and who does he give total control of the western armies? What? No. Who's going to march to the sea? Sherman. So as soon as General Grant is made overall commander of Union forces, he takes control of the eastern armies, and he puts General William T. Sherman in charge of all western armies. Now, the rest, for the most part, of the fighting in the eastern theater is going to be fought where? Virginia. Yep. The rest of the fighting in the eastern theater is going to be in Virginia. Whereas Sherman is going to be marching through Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Now the ideas I mentioned is the two forces. Grant, who will be fighting in Virginia, will eventually meet up with Sherman, who will be sweeping the South, and they will meet at Richmond, Virginia, the goal to take the capital and end the Civil War. So that takes us to the Virginia campaigns, very important battles. And there's going to be 3 very important battles fought in Virginia in 1864. 3 very important battles fought in Virginia in 1864. And we'll talk about each of them individually. There'll be the Battle of the Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsylvania, and the Battle of Cold Harbor. Yes, my dear?
Grant wanted to meet up with Sherman where?
At Richmond. So if you look here, we're going to have 3 major battles in Virginia, right here. While Sherman is basically sealing the South. He's going to go through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and the goal is to meet in Richmond. And there'll be 3 major battles in what we call the Virginia campaigns in 1864. The Battle of the Wilderness, the Battle at Spotsylvania, and the Battle at Cold Harbor. And the first one we will talk about today will be the Battle of the Wilderness. Battle of the Wilderness. This was a brutal battle. Now this Battle of the Wilderness was fought on May 5th and May 6th of 1864. May 5th and May 6th of 1864. Now in this battle, Union General Grant marched his men through an area in Virginia known as the Wilderness. It was 70 square miles of heavily wooded land that was referred to as Satan's country. It was 70 square miles of just thick wilderness land, trees, etc., known as Satan's country. So if you look up here, you've got this tremendous wilderness area, just thick wilderness. And once you get through the wilderness, you have this nice clear area. And the goal for General Grant is he was going to get through the wilderness and collide with Lee in this clearing on the other side of this forested land. What do you think Lee did? He thought to himself, we will, because we have less troops, we will attack the Union in the wilderness. We will not let them get to the clearing. It'll be our advantage if we fight them in the wilderness rather than let them get through the wilderness and fight in open land. So General Lee makes the decision to attack Union troops directly in the wilderness to hide the fact that he has half as many men as Grant does. So the battle will be in the wilderness. This battle lasted 2 full days and was considered the most savage fighting of the entire Civil War. This Battle of the Wilderness lasted 2 full days and was considered the most savage fighting of the entire Civil War. When the Battle of the Wilderness was over, the Union lost 19,000 men compared to the Confederate losses of 9,000. 19,000 Union soldiers were killed in the Battle of the Wilderness, 9,000 Confederates killed or wounded. Now that seems like a big discrepancy, but what's this continuing saga? Population. Okay? So Grant would see this as an advantage. If they lost 19,000, the Confederates lost 9, in his mind they were ahead of the game. Now the sad thing about this is what happened to many of the wounded soldiers on both sides that were wounded in the wilderness. They found them all right, too late. You shoot cannons into the wilderness, you shoot rifles, you have gunpowder. What happens in a wilderness area during a fight like this? Fires start. Many of the wounded burned to death. Many of the wounded burned to death. That would be the most horrible death possible I can imagine. So many wounded soldiers on both sides were burned to death as the wilderness caught on fire during cannon fire, etc. So if you were wounded, you had a great chance of not surviving because you would be burned to death. Now, as I mentioned, although Union casualties were much higher than that of the South, the Confederates suffered the most in the Battle of the Wilderness because they could not afford to lose soldiers. Okay, that'll take us to the Battle of Spotsylvania. Battle of Spotsylvania. Well, after the Battle of the Wilderness, General Grant continues his march towards Richmond. And on May 10th, 11th, and 12th, Confederate and Union forces meet in battle again, this time at Spotsylvania. So after the Battle of the Wilderness, General Grant continues his assault towards Richmond. And on May 10th, 11th, and 12th of 1864, Confederate and Union forces meet in battle again, this time at Spotsylvania. Again, General Lee and the Confederates failed to halt the Union advance towards Richmond. And during this 3 days of fighting, Grant loses another 12,000 men. And by this point in the Civil War, any Confederate loss would be devastating. Their population is running out. So even if Lee wins these battles, he loses if he loses any men. But in this particular Battle of Spotsylvania, Lee and the Confederates failed to halt the Union advance towards Richmond. Grant loses another 12,000 men, but at this point in the Civil War, any losses by the Confederates is going to be devastating. And that'll take us to our last subtopic of the day, which is the Battle of Cold Harbor. The Battle of Cold Harbor. Now, after the Battle of Spotsylvania, what does Grant do? He continues his march towards Richmond. And this time, Union forces will encounter Confederate forces at Cold Harbor. These are all in Virginia. Now, this was kind of interesting because the rebels dug in for the Battle of Cold Harbor. They dug 6 miles of trench line in which they fought from behind at Cold Harbor. What?
Who is that?
The rebels. The Confederates dug 6 miles of trench line that they fought in against the Union. And Grant, despite that, ordered a head-on attack against those 6 miles of rebel trench line. So the rebels, who can't afford to lose soldiers, decide they're going to dig 6 miles of trench line that they can fight out of, be more protected, while Grant marches his men head-on against that 6 miles of rebel trench line. Union soldiers were so sure that they were going to be killed once they knew what they were up against, that they actually pinned their names to their shirts so they would not die nameless. True story. The Union soldiers were so sure they would be killed at the Battle of Cold Harbor that they pinned their names on their shirts so they wouldn't die nameless. In just a couple hours of fighting at Cold Harbor, the Union lost 9,000 men. So let's add it up. How many men has General Grant lost in these 3 fights? How many?
30,000.
What did they have the first one?
19.
Second one?
12.
And then another 9. Okay. In the Virginia campaigns, Grant had lost over 30,000, but had 60,000 casualties, which means killed, wounded, or captured. He had 30,000 killed or wounded, 60,000 killed, wounded, or captured. He lost 60,000 men in those 3 battles, and he's still winning. What does that tell you about the population cycle here? It's a huge deal, and it's going to be the end for the Confederacy. Now, let's look ahead here. Tomorrow is Wednesday. We'll talk about General Sherman's march to the sea. We'll talk about a presidential election that's going to take part in the middle of the Civil War. And we're going to talk about the Deep South falling to the Union, and we'll eventually get to the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. I'm going to guess tomorrow's Wednesday. We'll finish the lecture Wednesday, Thursday. We'll have an open note test more than likely on Monday. Okay? So if you are not going to be here Thursday, I heard some kids talking about that. You'll need to make sure you get the lecture notes and be prepared for that open note test on Monday. Okay, everybody clear? Perfect. I don't mind tests on Monday if they're open notes, so generally don't like to have them if they're closed note on Monday.